Hey, welcome to the world of Mechieval. Before we jump into today's story, let me give you a quick rundown of what this world is all about. So, Mechieval takes place in an alternate version of Earth. Back during the time of the Black Plague, a group of people, now known as the First Heretics, tried to reach out to forces they didn't really understand. This event, which we now call the Second Summoning, ended up changing everything. In the year 1352, 200 mysterious beings of light descended onto Earth, and after that, things got bad. All over the world, strange creatures known as the Fallen started to rise. These beasts tore through kingdoms and left chaos in their wake. Fast forward to 1420, humanity finally fights back. That's when the Guardian armor was created. Basically, it's a mechanized knight suit, and it gave people a real shot at defending themselves. Thanks to that tech, new kingdoms began to rise from the ashes. If you're curious about where the Fallen actually came from, or how these new kingdoms were built, I've got separate videos that go deep into all of that.
Hello and welcome. This is Mechieval. In our last video, we covered the Wolf's Crusade. It was a military campaign led by Commander Margaret of the Order of Lost Women. The goal was to investigate the disappearance of women during the early Beastland expansions. Margaret organized 1,000 guardians divided into 4 divisions and marched beyond the secured frontier. The army engaged a large beast force in open terrain. The guardians held the center. The flanks were commanded by Genevieve Arnaud and Zinira Mbaye, and the rear by Beatrice de Moura with the steel wardens and bombards. The army maintained formation and defeated the first wave. The coordination of the beasts during that battle was the first indication that their attacks were no longer random. The army continued into the deeper plains, capturing the ruins of Qualamont and reaching a coastal crater. There, a new enemy appeared. Zhor Khul, later identified as the entity controlling the beasts. The battle that followed resulted in the loss of the entire expedition. Only Commander Zinira Mbaye survived, escaping by sea and returning to New France. Her report to the king and council was not accepted. The court dismissed her account as exhaustion and trauma. But her testimony marked the first confirmed record of an organized beast command structure. That was the Wolf's Crusade. The next chapter begins with the First War of Zhor Khul. A year after the Wolf's Crusade, Zinira Mbaye's warnings were dismissed as exaggeration. There were no reports of organized beast activity, and no evidence of Zhor Khul had been found. Over time, doubt spread even within her own order. The King of New France, weary of what he called fear-mongering, convened the first council of the heretic. He accused Zinira of possession and claimed her warnings threatened the peace established since the war. To avoid the methods of the first king, who had labeled dissenters as witches, he called for a formal judgment instead of execution. In the months that followed, movement was again reported on the northern plains. At first, the sightings appeared random. Soon, the scale changed. Scouts sent into the Beastlands began to return with records of growing gatherings. Each new entry showed larger concentrations of beasts forming across the frontier. Inside the Pyrenees fortress of New France, Zinira appeared before the royal council during the first council of the heretic. The assembly's purpose was to determine her fitness for command and to establish whether she was unstable or possessed. She presented her scouts written accounts, terrain charts, and patrol records. She urged the king to reinforce the line before the movement developed into another organized assault. The king refused. He stated that the frontier was secure and fully manned by the Guardian army. Warposts across the ridges of Valmont and the marshes of Sereil remained active, each armed and supplied. He declared that further mobilization was unnecessary and disruptive to public order. The council reached its conclusion. They judged that Zinira's behavior resulted from trauma sustained during the Wolf's Crusade. They advised that New France would no longer cooperate with the Order of Lost Women under her sole authority. To maintain relations, the Order established a divided command. Captain Raella was appointed internal commander, responsible for Witch Hall and coordination within the capital. Zanira retained her role as external commander, directing outposts and war posts under the Order's control beyond the city. That night, Zanira returned to Witch Hall. The fortress overlooked the eastern wall of New France and served as the Order's stronghold. She met with her officers and presented her decision. Raleigh would remain at Witch Hall to manage internal defenses, train initiates, and reinforce the wall if the line failed. Zanira would lead the majority of the Order's guardians north to strengthen the frontier. Before sunrise, the courtyards filled with the sound of steam furnaces and chain lifts. Armor suits were fueled, bombards checked, and supply wagons loaded with coal. 2,000 guardians and their steel wardens began the descent through the mountain passes toward the plains. The king was uneasy that the eastern wall now stood weakened, with most of the lost women's guardians marching out, yet he was relieved to be free of Zanira's presence. The army passed through the outposts that supplied the kingdom, farms, mills, and smelters that survived only because the line stood between them and the Beastlands. Every settlement felt the tremors that came from the north. The people lined the roads as the guardians passed, their expressions divided between pride and fear. The sight of the armored columns brought reassurance, but no one could tell what waited beyond the plains. By the third day, the column reached the eastern sector of the line. The defensive chain stretched unbroken across the horizon. Trenches reinforced with timber and iron, war posts venting furnace smoke, and bells mounted above the ramparts for alert signals. Zanira assumed command of the Lost Women's Eastern War Post. From there, she planned the defense of the entire sector and established new relay points to maintain contact with the Central and Western commands. She also considered the possibility of retreating eastward to reach the neighboring kingdoms if the line collapsed. For 3 nights, the plains remained quiet. Patrols returned with no sightings, and the wind carried only the constant sound of the furnaces. On the 4th night, the earth began to shift. The movement was steady and patterned. Scouts sent forward before dawn returned with their armor coated in dust. They reported columns of beasts moving in formation, spreading across the horizon. Zanira climbed the rampart. The wind carried the smell of ash and iron. In the distance, dust rose in thick lines across the plains. She signaled to a group of mounted scouts who had been held in reserve. They mounted at once and rode east to carry the warning. Moments later, the first horn sounded along the wall. Others followed in succession, the signal traveling across the entire frontier. Steam furnaces ignited, and the line came to life. The beasts had returned. The war she had warned of was beginning. The first sightings came at dawn. From every war post along the northern frontier, smoke signals rose into the sky one after another, marking confirmed contact across the line. The beasts had arrived in force. By midday, the horizon was filled with movement. Dust rolled for miles, forming a solid wall of haze. Beneath it, the army of Zhor advanced. It was not a scattered swarm. It was a structured army. Nearly 1 million beasts stretching across the plains from ridge to marsh, moving in unison. Zanira Mbai faced a decision. If she remained within the walls of the war post, the beasts would destroy the trenches and advance directly into New France. She ordered her guardians to move into the trenches. They would hold the line there. The elevated war post would be used for the bombards, which would maintain fire over the battlefield. The furnaces were brought to maximum pressure. Bombards fired in rotation, releasing bursts of shrapnel and flame into the haze. Steam poured from the vent towers and filled the cold air. The first wave struck the western sector. Darius Alvin, flame warden of the Sainted Flame, met it head-on. He stood on the rampart, swinging his chain mace, its internal fire growing brighter with each movement. He raised his voice over the noise of the bombards and called the oath of his order so that every soldier could hear. We are the guardians of humanity, the flame in the darkness, the light that stands against the void. The beasts charged. Their claws tore through timber and steel. Darius fought from the front, his weapon leaving trails of fire as it struck. The sainted flame held the western trenches for hours without yielding ground. The number of beasts worked against them, their mass creating congestion that allowed the bombards to strike with full effect. In the east, Zanira's division came under identical attack. The entire frontier was engaged at the same time. No sector could send or receive support. Communication bells carried short-coded messages confirming that all positions were in contact. The fighting continued through the night. Furnaces overheated. Ammunition ran low. Engineers worked without pause to keep the lines supplied. When dawn came, the plains were covered in smoke and the remains of the first assault. Thousands of beasts lay piled against the wooden walls. They were only the front ranks. New columns were forming beyond the haze. Zanira assessed the situation. The line still stood, but it was weakening. Zanira understood that holding it, even for a short time, would give New France the time it needed to prepare and withdraw the outposts near the frontier. The first day of the War of Zhor Khul ended with the line intact. The next wave was already approaching. By the next day of fighting, pressure on the western frontier reached its highest point. The beasts attacked without pause, striking in continuous waves against the war posts held by the Order of the Sainted Flame. Darius Alven, Flame Warden of the Order, commanded the defense from the high bastion at Valmont Ridge. His division, 3,000 armored guardians and 400 steel wardens, had been in constant
Thanks for
combat.
watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Their numbers had fallen, their furnaces burned without rest. The Culverinius Bombardians along the ridge had fired until their barrels glowed red. The western trenches were cut deep into stone and reinforced with timber and iron, but even the rock began to fracture under the repeated impact. When the seventh wave came, it struck with full force. Darius gave the order to abandon the outer trench. The defenders withdrew to the second ridge and formed a new line. From the command tower, Darius observed the plains below. The entire valley was moving. The beasts filled every visible direction. It was no longer a horde. It was a campaign, organized and deliberate. By nightfall, Valmont Ridge was surrounded. The communication drums in the western sector went silent, one after another. Messengers attempting to break through the encirclement did not return. Darius stood in the courtyard of the warpost, his armor blackened from heat and ash. He spoke the words of the sainted flame oath. We are the guardians of humanity, the flame in the darkness, the light that stands against the void. O flame, surge into the darkness. Bring the darkness to its knees. The guardians repeated his words as they fought. The line held for as long as it could. One by one, they fell. Fuel reserves were empty. Ammunition was nearly gone. At the last bombard tower, steel wardens worked the valves with their bare hands, refusing to stop. When the beasts breached the outer gate, Darius gave his final command. Seal the furnaces. All of them. The engineers obeyed. Pressure built across every line. Within moments, the bastion erupted. The explosion tore through the ridge, consuming both the warpost and the encircling beast in a single column of fire and steam. By morning, the western horizon was silent. Only a column of black smoke marked where Valmont Ridge had stood. The guardians of the Order of the Sainted Flame holding the western ridge were dead. Across the remaining sectors, the message spread through the communication drums. Valmont fallen. Western Ridge lost. The fall of Valmont broke the western anchor of the frontier. With the Sainted Flame destroyed, the beasts began to spread east and south, pressing against the remaining sectors of the line. The army of New France, under Commander Rafael Duarte, deployed his remaining guardians to contain the advance from the west, while maintaining pressure on the front. His forces were stretched across two directions, their lines too thin to hold. He began organizing an orderly withdrawal. Any guardian, steel warden, or civilian unit that reached New France would strengthen the city for what was coming. The central bastions fired until their pressure valves locked open. Culverinius bombardions overheated. Ammunition stores ignited. Even the strongest Guardian armor began to fail under continuous use. The wooden walls burned, collapsing into the trenches below. In the east, Zenira Mbaye commanded the forward defenses near Sereye. Her Guardians fought knee-deep in mud and blood. For every beast that fell, 2 more reached the trench. Her Steel Wardens worked without pause, moving through the lines to refuel furnaces, seal cracked joints, and weld broken armor plates while the fighting continued. Commander Duarte stayed behind with a rearguard to hold the beasts long enough for the withdrawal to succeed. Units began pulling back through the tunnel routes leading toward the Pyrenees approaches. It was slow work. The beasts pressed forward through every breach. When the central bastions collapsed, the entire front shifted, and the defensive structure of the line began to break apart. The Order of New France, still holding the eastern positions, received the withdrawal order. They began falling back toward the mountain passes to form a final defensive perimeter. Zenira knew what it meant. Her flank was now the last stable position on the frontier. If it failed, the beasts would have direct passage into the valleys below the Pyrenees gates. She made her decision. Break formation. Fall back to the mountain routes. We hold the retreat line. The eastern trenches erupted as the beasts broke through the far wall. Guardians turned their little bombardions inward, firing point-blank into the advancing columns. Entire companies fell as timber supports gave way and the trenches collapsed under the pressure. Zenira prepared to remain with the rearguard, but her captain, Rebecca, refused the order. She took Zenira's place, stating that the order would need its commander alive for what followed. Zenira was forced to withdraw while Rebecca and the remaining Guardians held the line. By dawn, the plains were lost. The line, once the strongest defensive structure of New France, was gone. What remained was burned earth and twisted iron. The survivors moved south through the valleys, carrying what supplies and wounded they could. Behind them, the plains were silent except for the slow, continuous sound of movement rising again from the north. The survivors reached the Pyrenees valleys. Behind them, the plains that had once held the line were gone, leveled and blackened, with only twisted steel and drifting ash remaining. The king's army regrouped at the base of the mountains and established a new defensive line across the lower gates of New France. Every furnace in the capital was lit. Every Culverinius bombardion and Pundragonus hurlbant along the walls was manned and armed. For the first time in the kingdom's history, the war had reached the mountain wall itself. The beast army advanced through the plains in numbers beyond estimation. Hundreds of thousands, possibly more. The king, Adrian IV, took command in person, standing atop the inner battlements with his generals and the remaining officers of the orders. Zenira Mbaye stood among them, her armor scarred and scorched from the retreat. At dusk, the wind shifted. Smoke and dust rolled down the northern slopes. The first ranks of beasts appeared through the haze covering the lower plains. Behind them came more, filling the horizon in all directions. The bombard towers opened fire. The valley thundered as the first shells struck. For hours, the beasts advanced through shrapnel and fire, climbing over their dead to reach the lower slopes. Guardians fought from trenches carved into the mountainside. Outnumbered and exhausted, they held their positions. Then the tremor changed. It grew heavier, deeper, and slower. Even the stone beneath the walls began to shake. The ground pulsed in rhythm with something vast approaching through the dust. Zenira felt the vibration under her boots and understood what it meant. Zhor Khul had arrived. The bombard towers fired again, but the rounds disappeared into the haze before making contact. The valley floor cracked under the creature's weight as it advanced. Its roar struck the mountain face and drowned the sound of every furnace and bombard. From the command wall, King Adrian IV gave the order. All batteries! Fire at will! The night turned red. The mountains echoed with continuous bombardment. The siege of New France had begun. Thank you for watching till the end. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Leave a comment below, it helps the channel and I'd like to hear your thoughts.